Welcome to the Babylonian Podcast. I am Michael Light, your host. And in this season of the Babylonian, we are going through the New Testament Apocrypha. And we invite you to join us too by either following along with the notes in the show notes below or by going to our website, thebabylonian.com. Either way, we're going to jump right into the New Testament Apocrypha, going with scholars, sages, and the scriptures, and Bibling on. All right. We have been going through the New Testament Apocrypha, and today we are going to be going through the Infancy Gospel of James, or as it is more widely known, the Protoevangelium of James. Peter, have you heard anything about the Protoevangelium of James?
I have. I watched a YouTube video about it.
Okay, cool.
I think there's some, to my knowledge, there's some dragons in there. Is this the one where there's dragons in, or is that another story of Jesus?
Yeah, there are quite a few other infancy gospels. Actually, I think there's a lot of New Testament Apocrypha that have dragons in them. Unfortunately, the Protoevangelium of James is not one of them. But it's a pretty cool infancy gospel, though.
Why are we even here?
What is this world without dragons? I guess that's what the Protoevangelium is all about, how to live in a world without dragons.
I guess there could be some advantage because we could maybe learn how other people saw and thought about Jesus and Christianity, even if some of the things might not be the most accurate.
Yeah, that might be one reason for our existence.
I think there's some other spicy things in there too, though.
Better things than this. There are better things than this.
More spicy things in the Protoevangelium of James.
As much as I want to promote this podcast, there are better things than reading New Testament Apocrypha. Many.
No, but there's some spicy stuff in this one, I think.
Oh yeah, there is definitely there's some pretty good stuff in here. In fact, well, actually, before I dive in a little bit more into the Protoevangelium of James, I've been talking about infancy gospels. I think I brought up twice that this is an infancy gospel. So just to clarify, an infancy gospel, it's actually pretty self-explanatory, but an infancy gospel is a story about Jesus when he was an infant, a little boy. So, because think about it, in the canonical gospels, we only have Jesus when he's 12 in the gospel according to Luke, and then we have him when he's age 30, presumably, in the other gospels, and then onwards. So what was happening before Jesus was 12 years old? Maybe even between being a 12-year-old and being 30, what was happening then? Although the infancy gospels don't really talk about that. But family of origin, what were the things that were happening in Jesus's early childhood as he was growing in wisdom and stature, as Luke says. So these are the infancy gospels that we're going to start going through. And there are two major ones. These are actually both fairly popular. I feel like these are among the more popular New Testament Apocrypha. There's the Protoevangelium of James, and there is the Gospel of Thomas. Sorry, the Infancy Gospel of Thomas. The Gospel of Thomas is also a popular New Testament Apocryphon, but that is not an infancy gospel. That's a different thing. And I'm sure, have you heard of the Infancy Gospel of Thomas before?
Is that the one where he makes birds?
Yes.
Maybe out of clay or something like that?
Exactly. Yeah, that is the opening of the Infancy Gospel of Thomas. So yeah, and that's also in the Quran, but that's another episode. But yeah, these two, the Protoevangelium of James and the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, are the two core central infancy gospels. And then all the other infancy gospels take from the Protoevangelium of James, all the infancy gospels that survived to today and that we have. The vast majority of them are pretty much, like with Marvel movies, how we had in the early 2000s, we had a Spider-Man. We had the Spider-Man trilogy with Sam Raimi and Tobey Maguire. Yeah. And then we had the Amazing Spider-Man, and then we had Tom Holland Spider-Man. We're getting the reruns, so maybe
The new
in
edition.
yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
and just a clarification, we've already mentioned this in the introduction to the New Testament Apocrypha, but these episodes we're talking about things that Christians do not consider to be the Bible. They don't believe it to be the gospel. We are not, by talking about them, we are not saying that it is the Bible, that it is authoritative or anything like that. We are merely saying that these are texts that have been written that mention the people who've written in time, mentioning and using characters or people from the Bible. And so they're probably largely fictitious, but their purpose might not be to try and convince us that this is true, though maybe it is, depending on the New Testament Apocrypha or the apocryphal work. The function could be a variety of things. So, and a way of thinking about it is like, if I were to sit down right now and I'm like, write up a fan fiction of, you know, the disciple Thaddeus, who doesn't get enough attention. I mean, write up a fan fiction about Thaddeus, and then I write that down for fun, and someone finds it. It's like, oh, this is Apocrypha, right? It's the New Testament Apocrypha, right? There's no guarantee that all of these texts are even being asserted by anyone as being
Historically,
religious or, yeah, historically accurate either, or anything like that. Though maybe some of it is. That's not, the purpose is not to discuss that.
yes. Yeah, that's such a great disclaimer to make at the beginning of this. Yeah, totally great. Yeah, and so when we say gospel, we're not saying like, oh, this should be in with the gospels. This is just the title that it has been passed down with.
Yeah, and really our purpose here is like, we want to learn. We want to learn about them and maybe what this says about this particular group of people, because what you write and what you think, that tells us about you. And the only metric that we're using is, Michael and I have a little bit of an orthodoxy tracker that we kind of threw out a number. It might not be the most accurate or not, but that's what we're judging. How compatible is this with Orthodox Christian beliefs? So
Yeah, precisely. Yeah, we're just we're looking at the first fan fiction about Jesus and trying to see what were the underlying assumptions of the normal lay people. You know, you might read the church fathers, which are probably really great, and you're learning a lot from this. But you know, what did the everyday person believe? You know, and what were the stories that were being passed around and told people, the legends, whether or not people believed that they were true. But yeah, we're just trying to see how people thought theologically, ethically, philosophically, or where their minds went, things like that. Yeah, that's great. So yeah, and also thank you for bringing that up. Another reminder that's recalling our first conversation on the New Testament Apocrypha. And again, if you haven't seen that, you should go ahead and see that because it's great. But when we say gospel, don't think that this necessarily has even the same style as the canonical gospels, where Jesus is going around and doing things. In fact, not only are these infancy gospels focused on Jesus's early childhood, some of them are going to be in some ways more focused on Mary. In fact, there's one where it's a lot of Mary carrying around Jesus and using him almost as like a totem. And in the Protoevangelium of James that we're going to be talking about today, this is a very early New Testament apocryphon that likewise spends a lot of time. Actually, this is really more of a gospel of Mary, quote unquote, not in that it talks about how she saves everybody, but this is more about the birth of Mary and then a little bit of her growing up to the point where she gives birth to Jesus. So that's what the Protoevangelium of James is. So if you're wondering, and this is a great question, if you're wondering it, Protoevangelium, why is it called the Protoevangelium? I mean, I think you know what the you can tell what Protoevangelium means with if you just parse the etymology of the word.
Yeah. So earlier I said Protoevangelicum, which is wrong apparently, but I guess proto means before, and evangelium is probably referring to, well, evangel, right? Like that's gospel, and that, right, is like before the gospel accounts. So it's referring to the events before Jesus turned 30, and we actually get to hear what Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John said.
That's actually really, I like that explanation of we're looking at what happened before the Gospels, like leading up to that. So the reason it's called the Protoevangelium, it's not called that in the text itself. It wasn't passed down with that name. It's by the scholar who discovered the text and translated it. Or I can't remember if it was rediscovered, but the scholar who translated it and made it popular called it the Protoevangelium because his claim was that this gospel was written before the canonical gospels. So he said that this was the first one. So pretty hot take. And of course, all scholars disagree with it. If you read the text, it reads like something that's very different, that's written more by somebody who's a big fan of something. When you read a non-canonical text, something that makes it very clear that it's non-canonical is you'll notice that it doesn't have a lot of scandalous stories. Or at least if it does have scandalous stories, it's often not going to intentionally portray offensive or hard to understand teachings or events. It'll show the good guys as being perfect. And if it's rewriting a story, it'll often even rewrite it so that, oh, this is the intention behind this biblical character doing this really terrible, awful, screwed up, jacked up thing, so that it makes them look even better. And it might even whitewash some of or take away the stories where, King David or Jacob, the son of Isaac, screws up. So if you read this text, it's a lot of it actually is even an apologetic for the virgin birth and all that stuff. So yeah, with that, we're just going to jump into the Protoevangelium of James. This gospel account, this apocryphal gospel, if you are asking where do all of our images or icons, if you're traditional like that, of the nativity, why do they all have Mary and Joseph and the Holy Family in a cave? Why specifically in a cave, right? We know that it was a manger. There are different arguments about what that could look like. I've heard a lot of people say that looks actually more like a second room, a side room with animals. It is with animals, but just about all traditional images of the nativity have it in a cave. And this is one of the early accounts where they give birth in a cave. Also, this is where we see, and again, this is a very early New Testament Apocrypha, and we're going to see the source of a high Mariology. And a Mariology is a theology of Mary, beliefs about Mary. When does that begin to take place? And we can already see like a very high Mariology here in the Protoevangelium of James. And then we also even see in this, and we'll get to this, but we'll even see in this Protoevangelium that Mary isn't just a virgin when she gives birth to Jesus. And this gospel account doesn't explicitly say it, but it makes a workaround so that Jesus can have siblings by law, but then Mary and Joseph Mary still stays a virgin, even though she's married to Joseph. So this is where we see all of that. So the Protoevangelium of James dates to the second half of the 2nd century. It was written by somebody who's Jewish in Syria. It was written in Greek. So there are 2 different claimed authors in this text. We have James, the son of Joseph, who's the James who wrote the canonical book of James, by the way, and Joseph. So it gets a little bit confusing because at the end, James talks about how, hey, I'm writing this. And then there's a part in the narrative where it's from Joseph's perspective and Joseph is talking in the first person. So it kind of contradicts, and you might think, oh, there's probably 2 sources here or something. Something is happening there. There's that. References. A lot of early church fathers have referred to this work one way or another, acknowledged its existence. Jerome, Origen, Justin Martyr, and Clement. So we have some pretty big early church fathers referencing this work. It's not necessarily that they're quoting it. When I say reference, I'm just saying whether they spoke against it or spoke for it. We just know that they talked about it.
Yeah. So if I mention, let's say I'm alive in 200 AD and I mention, oh, look, I read this comic book where Dr. Octopus fights Spider-Man. People will say, oh, people were talking about Dr. Octopus fights Spider-Man back in 200 AD. And the way that content must have been created before then. Otherwise, I can't reference it. And so since we know the time of these particular people, like Jerome and Justin Martyr, we can therefore say, okay, that's the dating for it.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. And we can also know that it was, at least to some extent or another, it was maybe a little bit more widespread, and these people are talking about it. Yeah. So that also helps us with dating it. This is understood to be like a midrash for Matthew and Luke's birth narratives. So midrash is pretty much like it's like a specific, I honestly don't know what the markers are for what makes this a biblical recasting as a midrash, but it's a Jewish genre where you retell a canonical biblical event. So yeah, anyways, the infancy gospels we talked about how the infancy gospels, a lot of them are inspired by the Gospel of Thomas and the infancy gospel of Thomas and this gospel. So between those two, we have pseudo Matthew, the Arabic infant traditions, the Armenian infant traditions, and Latin infant traditions. All those traditions and Apocrypha that fall under those are all influenced by this and or the infancy gospel of Thomas. Okay, and by the way, I'm just seeing in my notes that the person who gave this the name, the Protoevangelium of James, is the Latin translator Postel. And so yeah, and he claimed it was older than the canonical gospels. And some people say that it's what's called a composite text. Do you know what composite literature is? Do you want to explain that?
No, I actually have no idea.
Okay, a composite text, think of putting together, and position together. So it means various different sources are put together to make one whole thing. So earlier it had been argued that chapters 1 through 16 is its own text, its own story, and then chapters 17 through 20, its own thing, its own story, and then chapter 22 through 24, its own thing and its own story, and then chapters 21, I guess chapter 21 is added later to connect all of it together, and somebody has all these three books open in front of them, and then they're copying them and then writing links so that it makes one story. Some earlier people argued for this, but now scholars are tending to argue against that. But it probably, while it isn't probably exactly three sources put together, it probably is relying on the use of other earlier written sources. So they're probably looking at it, but not copying word for word from three different sources, if that makes sense.
Sure. No, that makes sense.
Yeah, so
Cool.
They're taking inspiration or something like that from these other sources that are already written.
All right. Let's dig in.
Yeah, let's look at this text. So in the beginning, this text opens up with a character named Jehoiakim. And Jehoiakim, he wants to go to the temple and give these sacrifices, and he wants to even give extra sacrifices. But then this one guy comes to him, Reuben. He says, it's not lawful for you to offer your sacrifices first because you have begotten no offspring in Israel. And so Jehoiakim, he becomes disappointed. And so he goes and he looks at the Old Testament and he says, well, let me see if anyone in the Old Testament, let me see if any of those fathers didn't give birth to their children. And he looks in it and he sees how even Abraham is given a son, Isaac. And then he sees how everybody has a son, and he becomes just extremely sad. And so he goes off into the wilderness to fast. Can you guess for how long he fasts for?
39 days. 40 days.
Close. Yes. Yeah. 40 days and 40 nights. He goes off to the wilderness to fast for 40 days and 40 nights. And he says, I will not go down for food or for drink until the Lord my God visits me. My prayer shall be food and drink, which is such a great quote.
Bold.
Yeah, really wants a son. And a reminder that children in this time were, I mean, it's having a child, which is great. As parents, you'd love to have somebody that you can put your compassion into and raise and bring up. But it's also a status symbol, right? You have a higher status, as we can just see here. So yeah, do you notice anything in this section that's kind of interesting? I mean, we have two obvious biblical allusions that the story is trying to track onto. But yeah,
Well, is it Jehoiakim?
Mm-hmm.
Chim?
Jehoiakim.
Is that?
Yes.
Do you think that's by accident? I know that's related to one of the last kings of Judah before the exile. Do you think that's related, or is that just kind of there?
Yeah, I did remember that there was a king by that name. That might be something to look into because I'm sure that they chose typologically significant names. I have a gut feeling. I didn't look into that. But yes, he does share the name with one of the kings from Israel's.
There's a Jehoiakim and Jehoiakim, and like one of them dies and the other one gets spared out of Babylon, I think. Anyway, so I guess that's not what we're going for. Okay, so the obvious one is, 40 days and 40 nights, he's fasting, right? Which reminds us of Jesus. It also reminds us of Moses, right? Because Moses fasts on Mount Sinai. And then he wants a child.
Yeah. And he reads in the Old Testament a story
about Abraham.
Yeah. Yeah.
And Abraham is given a child.
Yeah.
Okay, I don't have anything further than that. That's where my brain goes.
No, yeah, those are the two. So yeah, I mean, but the story is being very explicit about its connection of like when it's telling the story about Jehoiakim, it wants you to be like, just so we're clear here, it's kind of making the reader think, oh yeah, can I think in the Old Testament? And you can think of these characters, Abraham, Samson's father, he also gets a son. Hannah, yeah, and we're also going to hear from Jehoiakim's wife's perspective, and that's going to be very much like very clearly tied on to the Hannah story. But yeah, Abraham, all these, you think through, okay, yeah, you're right, and you're especially supposed to think of Abraham, right? The one who God first makes a covenant promise with, to work specifically with his family line. That's Abraham, and so this is like typologically significant. We have we're looking at a new Abraham, Moses type person. So yeah, so that's Jehoiakim's backstory. Then we look at his wife, and his wife's name is Anna. And Anna, of course, is the name Hannah, but without an H, which I think might be the same. It might just be whenever it's written in a different language, it becomes Anna, but it's at least very similar.
Is she going to be the mom of Mary?
Yes, exactly.
Because Saint Anne, right? That cool. Okay.
Do you want to share about Saint Anne and maybe her ties to another important person or two?
There's something going on there with Martin Luther way later, but I actually don't remember much. So, but yeah, Saint Anne.
Sorry, I keep putting you on the spot, but yes, Saint Anne is the person that I think he's Martin Luther's patron saint even before he becomes a monk. And if you know anything about Martin Luther, just like one of the big things that happens to him is early on is there's this thunderstorm and he thinks he might die, and he throws himself to the ground and prays to Saint Anne to save him and says that if he survives, then he'll go and become a monk. So this is that Saint Anne, by the way. It's the mother of Mary. So yeah.
Dang.
Yeah.
Man, now I'm really, all right, what happens next?
Yes. Yeah. So Anna is this dude's wife, Jehoiakim's wife, and she gives two dirges, two lamentations. One, she mourns over her widowhood, which I'm guessing is a reference to Jehoiakim going off and saying, I will not eat or drink until I have a child. So she's not technically a widow. And then two, she grieves for her childlessness. And then because she doesn't have any children. And then she has this maid named Judith. Now, Judith is the female name version of the name Judah. So I think she might represent Jews in Judaism. So we already have Jehoiakim fulfilling Abraham, like the OJ, the original Jew. And then we have Anna, and she has a maid named Judith. So this is perfect. This is great. Anyways, Judith says, she's like, how long are you going to be fasting? The day of the Lord is drawing near and it's not lawful for you to mourn. And I think the day of the Lord is a reference to a Jewish feast day. She says, take this headband, which the mistress of work gave me. It is not right for me to wear it because I'm a servant and it bears a royal cipher. And Anna does not have it. She says, get away from me. I will never do it. The Lord has greatly humbled me. And who knows whether you're whether a deceiver gave it to me and you're trying to get me to share in your sin. And Judith is like, why should I curse you? The Lord has shut up your womb to give you no fruit in Israel, which is like, I'm not sure how to take that reading that, but Anna is extremely sad. So remember, Jehoiakim had also been reproached by Reuben, who told him, hey man, you can't sacrifice first, even though you want to give all these extra gifts because you don't have any children. And now Anna is going to lament twice. Her maid reproaches her 2 times. And Anna is really sad. She takes off her mourning garments, washes her head, puts on her bridal garments, and in the 9th hour, she goes into her garden to walk there. And by the way, the 9th hour is the hour, it's 3 p.m. in regular time today around the world. This is the hour at which Jesus dies on the cross in the canonical Gospels, by the way. And so she goes off to pray. And she goes and sits under a laurel tree and prays to God to bless her and hear her prayer, just as he blessed the womb of Sarah and gave her a son, Isaac. And so now she's tracking on to the story of Abraham and Sarah as well. And then she sighs towards heaven. She's under a nest of sparrows in the laurel tree, and she sings this lamentation about how, like, even these birds that she sees, even the beasts of the earth and in the water, and all these produce life, but she can't produce life in her womb. And so she's just grief-stricken and very sad. So that's the backstory for Anna. So I've kind of winked at quite a few connections and points here, but I don't know if I want to give you any space for any thoughts that you have as well, or if you want to clarify those or expound on those.
No, I think it's pretty straightforward, and it's keeping with a common theme. There's people who want to have kids and they don't have kids yet. And there's hints that there's probably going to be kids that are coming their way. And that's a big deal. That happens a lot in the Bible.
Yeah, exactly. And it's especially keen on to the first fathers of Judaism. It really wants you to get the idea that this is the completion of the Old Testament scriptures. So yeah, anyways, as he said, the next thing that happens is an angel of the Lord appears to her and says, "The Lord has heard your prayer, and you are going to conceive, and you're going to bear, and your offspring will be spoken of in the whole world." And Anna says, "No matter whether I give birth to a male or female, I will bring it as a gift to the Lord my God, and the child shall serve the Lord all the days of my life," which is a connection to, y'all know it,
Hannah and Samuel.
Yeah, Hannah.
But can I point out something?
Yeah.
There's a little sketchy right there. He's like, whether it's a male or a female, I might have some little bit of like I don't know, sexist-ish, or maybe I don't want to say sexist, but like a hope for a particular gender. They're like, even if you give me the one that I don't want.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. No, you're right. It does kind of expose kind of the assumption that in that day, women weren't seen with the same amount of value.
But it's also opening up the door for that baby to be Mary, which helps us out, right? Because functionally, we need Mary to have a really cool birth.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's a good point. Yeah. And it does, in a sense, it kind of connects it even more to Samuel, I guess, in that it's saying, even though Mary is a lady, is a woman, we still want you to remember that we're tying Mary's story into Samuel's story, even though she's a lady and he's a guy. But yeah, it also has that assumption behind it. Yeah, which is how an earlier view of womanhood. So yeah, anyways, yeah. And then two angels come and they tell her, and again, we have, Jehoiakim has one person reproach him once. He goes off and fasts. Mary she has two lamentations. She gets reproached twice. And then she goes and sings a third lamentation. And then she gets one angel come to her. And then she has two angels come to her. So it's like this very, really nice structure. And then these two angels come to her and say, "Look, Jehoiakim, your husband, is coming, and we already told him about everything, and he's going to give up his animals as sacrifices." And so they go off and they give up the sacrifices. Yeah. So sees Jehoiakim, she runs to him, throws her arms around him, hugs him. Oh, they're both glad. They're glad that they're going to conceive again. And then they give the sacrifices.
Since we've referenced Samuel, the story of Samuel, you see it at the beginning of 1 Samuel, and the story is pretty simple. There's polygamy allowed at this time, wherein the man, he has two wives. Hannah is the wife that doesn't have any kids, so she's actually really bothered by that frequently. And he says, "Hannah, am I not enough for you? Am I not worth this many children to you?" And she's like, "I really want a kid." So then anyway, she goes and she prays at the temple. She looks like she's drunk with how much she's pouring out her heart before God. There's a man who is clergy at the temple. His name is Eli. Eli says, "Hey, why are you drinking?" He kind of calls her out. She's like, "No, I'm not drinking. I want a child." Anyway, she makes a commitment that if she has a child, that she'll dedicate him to the Lord. And sure enough, she has a son. His name is Samuel. And Samuel is a significant judge / prophet. They called them seers at that time, who is playing a role in the lives of Saul and David, which are the monarchs in the early Old Testament.
Yeah. Yeah, great recap. Also, Samuel is the last, if you read like especially extra biblical intertestamental Jewish literature, they'll note how Samuel, we talk about him as pretty good in the church, but they talk about him as like one of the top G's because he's one of the last prophets before the king, before the monarchy, like you just said, which might also be why we think of Mary coming as kind of a new Samuel as she's about to give birth to the new king of Israel. So yeah, thanks for bringing that up. And that's
Ooh,
also
that is really
another,
interesting.
yeah, yeah. So this, whoever wrote this, they may not have believed in dragons, but they were really tight on their Old Testament, writing really great stories. So there's just, yeah, if you can tell, this is a really good New Testament apocrypha. So anyways, here we don't have a virgin birth of Mary. In Catholicism and earlier on in Catholicism, that's the more popular, that's the more well-known denomination, at least in the West, to believe that Mary's mother, Saint Anne, gave birth to her as a virgin. So we don't have that in this early text, although that will go on to be the assumption. Notice how it's after Jehoiakim comes that they conceive and they give birth. So, but either way, there's a lot of emphasis on this Mary person. You can see that we already have a really high view of Mary and she hasn't even been born yet. So after she gives birth to this child, she's 6 months old. She puts her on the ground to walk, see if she can walk. She's only 6 months, which is that's a pretty good age to start walking at. And she takes 7 steps to her mother, and Anna rejoices and she says she is not going to walk on this ground again. The next time she walks, she's going to walk in the temple. So she makes for her a little sanctuary, and then she has these pure, undefiled Israelite virgins take care of her and carry her everywhere that she needs to go and care for her in every way that she needs to be cared for. So Mary turns 2 years old, and Jehoiakim says, hey, maybe we should take him to the temple. We should take her to the temple and dedicate her now. And Anna says, no, let's wait for the 3rd year, which is like, okay, come on. That's a classic, third year. So Anna makes this mini sanctuary for Mary. So you can see there's a pretty high view of Mary. She makes this, and I'm guessing that this is kind of trying to get us to connect Mary to being a sanctuary herself, being like the temple in whom Jesus lives. Because actually, the visitation scene, whenever the angel comes and says to Mary that the Holy Spirit will overshadow you, and you will conceive and give birth to a son and you will call him Jesus. The word overshadow there is actually the same word in the Septuagint that talks about the presence of God coming down upon the tabernacle in the Torah. And so early church fathers would talk about how Mary is kind of like a tabernacle or a temple. She's, one fancy theological term is the Theotokos, or the one who carries God herself. And so I might be off on this, but I'm pretty sure that the mini sanctuary that she makes for her has to do with Mary being connected and being synonymous to the temple itself. I don't know if you have any other thoughts on it, but that's the closest thing that I could come up with.
No, I think that's a very interesting insight. I think that sounds, I mean, we'd want to be careful about like stretching something beyond what we know, but I mean, sure. I think that sounds reasonable.
Yeah. So it's also at the same time, this is her preparation for before she goes into the temple itself. So when she's 3, they hand her over to the temple, which I'm not sure, but I don't think that women were able to be dedicated to the temple, especially at that time, especially because there was a certain court. Women could only go so far into the court. So there was a court for Gentiles, people who were non-Jewish, and then that's the furthest out, the court that's furthest out from the temple. And then there was another gate that could go a little bit closer into the temple. And we're not talking about the temple building here. We're talking about the temple precincts and all the area around it. And women could go to that. And then there was another one for men and then for the priests. So either way, in this rendition, in this tradition, Mary is given over and she grows up in the temple until she turns 12. But once she turns 12, there's an issue because the priests need to figure out what they're going to do with Mary before she starts menstruating, and then she would be impure, and obviously she can't make the temple impure. You can't be in the temple on your period. You have to go through all these purification rituals before you can enter back in because of purity, not holiness and virtuosity, but what's seen as clean and unclean. So the priests are asking around themselves. They're like, what are we going to do? She's turned 12, and they come up with an idea. And their idea is to have all the elders, all these chief elders, have them come all together, and they're all going to bring a staff. And whichever one has a sign, that's going to be the sign for the person who will take Mary in and marry her. Which, what is that a reference to? Do you know the reference of the staffs?
Yeah, I don't remember where in Numbers, but in Numbers there's a part where there's a rebellion. I think it's Korah's rebellion. Is it Korah's rebellion?
I think
it might be Korah's rebellion.
Yeah.
But either way, there are people who are saying they're like, we're done with Moses. So Numbers is a book wherein Moses has led the people of Israel outside of Egypt, but they have not yet entered into the promised land. And so there's a lot of wandering going around, and there's a lot of interesting things that explore the relationships between the people of Israel in that time and their relationship with God and their relationship with Moses and Moses' relationship with God. And at that time, the people got really upset, and they wanted to throw they wanted to reject the authority of Moses in some sense. And then God has Moses go ahead and I guess there's some kind of staff comparison. I don't remember exactly. And then like his staff buds, like there's like flowers or some form of fauna coming out of his staff. So they're like, oh, this is to show that God is real. And then I believe if this is Korah's rebellion, I think Korah's rebellion is also the one where those who disagreed with Moses, God opened up the ground and swallowed them. But it's important because Moses and Aaron are both from the tribe of Levi. And of the 12 tribes, this one was associated with priesthood, which take care of the temple. And so I guess that's kind of where it's significant, because it's kind of saying I'm going to guess that it's going to be Joseph's whose staff is going to bud here. And that would make him some kind of priest-like person.
Yeah. Yeah. So I don't think it's Korah's rebellion now that I think of it, because I think it's the 12 tribes. And if I remember correctly, Korah was a priest and he was talking against Moses. And I think it's Aaron's rod that buds, actually, and not Moses's.
Okay.
So it's the 12 tribes. And then Aaron's rod buds and an almond grows out of it. So yeah, but either way, you're still on the right track. You got all that right. But yeah, it's the 12 tribes of Israel. They all have these staves that they put in front of the tabernacle. And then Aaron's is the only one that grows an almond out of it, which is like, imagine putting a stick on the ground, a dead stick, and then it just starts sprouting. So yeah, they're just like, we'll see what happens with these rods. We'll see what become of them. And they have 12. Of course, like you pointed out, this is, again, typologically connecting Joseph to Aaron and the Levites, and it's showing him as like a representative of the ultimate Israelite. So all of the elder staffs actually do nothing. None of them do anything. And then later they invite Joseph in, and Joseph takes his staff, and a dove comes out of the rod to fly over Joseph's head. So this isn't just like an almond growing on here, just a winky dinky little almond. This is like a whole like dove coming over him, which for me, I think that's kind of like,
yeah, if I was like not a Christian, and I mean, this is post 70 AD, so maybe Judaism probably looks a little different than at the time of Jesus, but I have this view of like Aaron's staff budded, and this is the priesthood, and this is a big deal. And then Joseph, who is not even a Levite, a bird comes out of it. Might be kind of like I don't know, maybe not the nicest. I wouldn't feel the best about this particular literature. Right?
Yeah.
I feel like that's a reasonable reaction.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good perspective. I haven't thought of it as much from like, how would the original readers take this. But I guess if you're a Christian and you're reading this, you're like, oh, this is great. And it's even connecting it to Jesus, right? I'm pretty
Yeah.
sure.
How is it connecting it to Jesus?
The way I think it's connecting it to his baptism when the Holy Spirit appears over him looking like a dove. And so Jesus's baptism is kind of like a demonstration of God's election, that God has chosen Jesus as the person who's going to save humanity. And so now here, Joseph is shown as the person who's going to marry Mary. Now, this is where it gets interesting, and this kind of adds to the high Mariology. Well, at first you might be taken aback by this, even thinking like, what, an early Christian wrote this? It actually makes sense in view of a high Mariology, but Joseph initially actually doesn't even want to marry Mary. First, mostly just because he already has his own children to take care of. So, first of all, you see that Joseph is kind of like a kinsman redeemer. Like in Ruth. Well, no, sorry, kind of like the first kinsman redeemer, right? Who was going to take Ruth, but then was like, oh, I have to take care of Ruth's family. Never mind. But it's actually the opposite, because first he says, oh, I need to take care of my family. But then once they commend him and say, like, this is like something important, he ends up marrying her. But also, you see, one, all of Jesus's siblings, which are mentioned throughout the New Testament. You have to wonder, if Mary was going to stay a virgin, how did Jesus have all of these half siblings? And you don't have to believe that Mary stayed a virgin, but that is what ends up happening, at least in the West, for the Roman Catholic Church. So this right here, already very early on, before even the end of the 2nd century, you see this kind of apologetic where it's not saying anything directly or clearly, but it's set up so that you're like, that seems like pretty probable. Joseph already has all of his children, so there's no need for him to have had any children by Mary. And Joseph doesn't even feel the desire to marry Mary, let alone sleep with her and make her not a virgin anymore. So you can see this kind of clever workaround happening here.
Yeah, see, I noticed the first part, right? Like, we want to prevent Mary from having to have kids in the right person here. Like, if I want to create that, but the whole Joseph not desiring to even marry her. Wow, that's clever.
Yeah.
They thought through the details on this one.
Yeah,
That's for sure.
Yeah, this is a very, whoever wrote this is a genius, and it just gets better in the virgin birth apologetics, and even just the virgin birth of Jesus. So anyways, she meets with Elizabeth, and they all rejoice that they're having children, like in the canonical Gospels, Luke. And then Mary hides herself for the last 6 months so that nobody will see her. So that also is like, I thought about it. I'm like, if you're a teenager who people know that you're engaged but not married, and you're walking around with a big bump, and then you end up having a child like right after you're married and the bump's gone, people are going to be thinking, wow, that's kind of suspicious. And I don't feel like that lady just ate a bunch of cake, got married, adopted a son, and then worked it all off.
Yeah. Yeah, this is not a I ate 15 pounds of cake one evening New Year's party kind of result thing. This is something a little bit bigger and longer lasting.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah. So it's a pretty good explanation for why people aren't thinking bad things about her for now. Yes.
I have a question. So you've mentioned that Mary is about 12 at the time of these, but is she going to be 12 whenever she's going to give birth? And is this why because I know there's some people who say that Mary was 12, and then there's some people who actually say, no, that's false. She probably was not 12 at the time that she gave birth to Jesus. Is the idea of her being 12 originating from this text?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. Actually, the next thing I was going to say is some manuscripts say she's 14 or 15, but the manuscript it notes it in this New Testament Apocrypha that I'm reading with J.K. Elliott, but the manuscript he goes with says 16. So remember, this is skipping over. As you can see, this is going through, it's kind of showing the highlights of Mary's life from her conception to 6 months old to 2 to 3 to 12 to 14 to 15. So yeah, I did skip quite a bit. Actually, yeah, I guess that she got engaged. I guess this was a pretty long engagement now that I'm thinking about it, because it doesn't talk about the time passing, but it just mentions how old that she is after the fact. But yeah.
So she's engaged at 12, but she doesn't get married until after she's 16?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah,
That's like as long as high school.
Yeah. Yeah, so she gets engaged when she's in like 6th or
7th
7th
grade.
grade. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then it's not till she's in, depending on the manuscript, she could be in 9th or 10th grade at the oldest. So, yeah. I mean, sorry, married. It seems like what happened is the engagement whenever they find Joseph, but maybe there was some time where they kept her somewhere else, but they just knew that Joseph was going to be chosen and she got engaged. I don't know about what first century engagements look like, but today I would think that they would be shorter. Either way, yeah, she's either 16, 14, or 15, according to this text. So I'm guessing that this is probably the origin of where that whole assumption of her being around that age. And it's probably, even though this text is quite a bit removed from Mary's life, let alone Jesus's, I'm guessing that they still had similar timing for when people were getting engaged and married and giving birth. But as for being 12, I mean, this text even talks about how Mary would have been just coming to the time where she would just barely be able to start giving birth physically. So yeah, I assume that, yeah, this text very well might be where we get that from. So
interesting.
Yeah. So yeah, if you
What's Bible?
next, yeah, Bible and on, but yeah, next time it's Advent and somebody mentions, this all happened when Mary was 16 years old, present them with this podcast and tell them, did you know that is from the Protoevangelium of James? And you're the winner of the Advent Bible trivia.
It depends on what manuscript you read. Which manuscript did you read? You got 12? I don't think so. Over the Babylonian, they read it, she was 16.
Yeah. And then, if you happen to be with somebody who mentioned that and referred to this podcast, and you happen to be paying more attention, you could say, some manuscripts say 14 or 15. So,
Ooh.
yeah. So actually, none of the manuscripts say 12. All the manuscripts are for when she gave birth. All the manuscripts say she was 12 whenever she was leaving whenever the priests were deciding what to do with her and kicking her out of or moving her out of the temple.
So the people who say 12, they just didn't read the whole thing. They're like, "Oh, I found something interesting I can go ahead and mention," be like, cultural context.
Exactly.
You just need 2 facts to look impressive.
Yeah. They got to the Mary was 12 part and they're like, okay, I think I'm done reading here. Mary was 12. I got the information I was coming from. If you want that information, here you go. Even quicker, the Babylonian podcast. It's great. Yeah. Anyways, so yeah, Mary, 16-year-old, she's pregnant. And then Joseph finds out, and Joseph is shook. And so Joseph starts talking about how Eve had been deceived by the serpent while she was alone and then tricked Adam. And he uses this to talk about in a prayer to God, or maybe it's like a personal woe, but he uses this and says, like, I'm going to be the next Adam. Mary got tricked alone into adultery, and now this is going to bring shame upon myself. Which in the book of Genesis, in Genesis chapter 3, of course, it says that Adam was with Eve. So Adam is actually, this actually kind of takes responsibility off of Adam and kind of makes Adam not as much as a guilty bystander, just listening to the serpent deceive Eve. But that's just in Joseph's little woe there. And so anyway,
yeah, he wasn't this right.
Yeah, for all the great stuff in this text, it is a little bit, shifts more the blame onto Eve there in Genesis 3. But anyways, Joseph fears that if, he hides Mary's son, he's going to be guilty of her sin. But if he exposes the sin, then the pregnancy might actually have been from an angel, even though Mary only said that she was a virgin and she didn't say anything about the Annunciation. So this gives an explanation for why Joseph has to put away with Mary in secrecy. And again, like you said in the first episode, these people had a more communal view of things. It wasn't just you do your own personal fault and you're only guilty for that. The sin of one family member could bring shame upon the whole family, like you were talking about when you referred to the shepherd of Hermas. That's just honestly, that's the majority view throughout the world and throughout time. And so that does, in the story, that gives a pretty good reason for why. And that does, it seems that in the biblical account, it's his righteousness, Joseph's righteousness. And here it's talking about the shame as well as a reason for why he wants to do away with him. So this is where it gets kind of spicy, because not only does Joseph find out, but even with Mary hiding, the priests find out, and they accuse Joseph of having slept with Mary to impregnate her when they find out that she's pregnant. So I believe it's Leviticus, where there's the whole test where an unfaithful wife will put her hand into, or no, sorry, she won't put her hand, she'll drink this water. Do you want to explain this? You might remember it better than I do.
Yeah, it's not Leviticus, it's in Numbers 5.
Okay.
Numbers 5 is where if a woman is caught in adultery, it's if the man specifically believes that the woman may have committed adultery against him, she's required to drink some kind of water. I don't remember what it is. It's a bitter water. And basically, it won't hurt her at all if she hasn't slept with anyone else. But if she has, it will hurt her. That's basically kind of the concept there. Yeah, that's about it.
Yeah.
And kind of as a brief little apologetic, in case that might sound a little bit offensive to anyone, contextually, it does gives a defense for women. So it's not just saying that, in God's law at this time, it's not just, hey, whatever the man says, the man must be right. Instead, the man is forced to go ahead and bring it to the temple, and God is the judge. God is the ultimate judge. And if she's innocent, and he can't just, oh, well, she's guilty. So I think that's something that's kind of cool about Numbers 5. But
yeah, that's great. Thanks for sharing that. That's a great explanation, and also cultural context for why this isn't just like a patriarchal, misogynistic, thing against women. Yeah, and that would also be bringing shame on the man itself, as we even see in this text, which is apocryphal. Like, it's shameful to be like, hey, this is my wife and I'm accusing her of adultery or whatever. So yeah, so it's great to have that before you read this, because you might start misremembering that otherwise. Because what happens in this is the priests come up to Joseph and they're like, hey, what's happening? Because your wife is pregnant. And the priests accuse Joseph rather than Joseph going to the priests. So, and then here's the second interesting turn. So whenever Numbers 5, whenever the woman who's accused of adultery drinks from the bitter water, it does nothing to her if she didn't commit adultery. But if she does commit adultery, then her thigh swells. Well, that doesn't really mean much for men because they can't carry children in them. In this account, they make Joseph and Mary both drink from the water. It's called the water of conviction, to see if they committed adultery. So both of them drink from it here. But then the priests find out that Mary actually was a virgin. So this is kind of like, a next level apologetic for this. Is not only did Mary not sleep with another man, but Mary didn't sleep with Joseph. And we know because Joseph drank from that bitter water as well.
Dang, there you go.
Yeah. So
that is interesting, because otherwise I'm like, that's a weird application. Now you're making Joseph drink it. But now it's like, okay, I see what they're doing. They're trying to be very, very clear. She was a virgin.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is some pretty clever apologetics. So anyways, that happens. So far, everything has been worked out. And of course, the angel tells Joseph that it's not by adultery that Mary is carrying Jesus. So anyways, the decree comes by Augustus. And so Joseph and Mary, they travel off to Bethlehem. And Mary starts feeling Jesus pressing in her and starting to come out. And so Joseph stops and they head for a cave in a desert to hide her shame so that she can give birth. So they don't really look for an inn in this one. They're just like, yeah, we're just going to go to the cave because it's about to happen, which honestly, it's kind of a God-given gift that in the canonical gospels in history, what actually happened was, it'd be terrible. You're traveling with your pregnant wife and then all of a sudden, it pops on you. What you going to do under a bush, or I don't know. Yeah, not that a manger is, the recommended place to give birth in the first place. But either way, yeah. if you want to know where your nativity scenes come from, where your icon images come from, or whatever, after the Protoevangelium of James is when we got the new nativity scenes where instead of being in a manger, Mary and Joseph are in a cave. That comes from the Protoevangelium of James here. So this is actually a really interesting part. And I wanted to read it and see what you think. So they find a cave, and Joseph's like, well, let me find a midwife who can help you, give birth to your child. And this is just like you can very clearly picture this in cinema. I'm not too sure what's happening though, what the author is trying to do, but you can see this as like a slow motion scene. So anyways, in chapter 18, it says, he found a cave there and brought her into it and left her in the care of his sons and went out to seek for a Hebrew midwife in the region of Bethlehem. And now this is the part. So remember how it said he, referring to Joseph. And then next verse, now I, remember how I talked about in the beginning, how it switches from third to first person. So you can see that he's probably using different sources here. It says, now I, Joseph, was walking, and yet I did not walk. And I looked up to the air and saw the air in amazement. And I looked up at the vault of heaven and saw it standing still and the birds of the heaven motionless. And I looked down at the earth and saw a dish placed there and workmen reclining, and their hands were in the dish. But those who chewed did not chew, and those who lifted did not lift, and those who put something to their mouth put nothing to their mouth. But everybody looked upwards, and behold, sheep were being driven, and they did not come forward, but stood still. And the shepherd raised his hand to strike them with his staff, but his hand remained upright. And I looked at the flow of the river and saw the mouths of the kids over it, and they did not drink. I think the kids there are young goats. And then suddenly everything went on its course. So I have no idea what any of that is about. I don't know what that means. My understanding is like, if I was reading this in a contemporary novel, I'd just be like, oh, this is a poetic way of saying everything's going slow motion as I'm like freaking out about my wife giving birth to the Savior of Israel. I don't know if you have any other thoughts on that.
So alternative interpretations here that I don't think any scholars have, agree or disagree with me on this because I don't know what they're thinking, but perhaps Joseph is just moving really fast. It's showing the urgency that he has for his wife and for his virgin wife and his child to be born. He can't wait to see it. So he's going so fast that everything else stops. So it's just like, in the movie scenes where they have Flash or one of the other really fast people dash. Basically, that could potentially be it. Or everything stops in mid-place. I think one thing that's really interesting, though, is I was listening to that the sheep, they stopped moving, and the shepherd was about to go ahead and strike them, but his hand got frozen. So my question is he striking them for not moving? And if so, did they get frozen before him? Anyway, I don't think that's particularly helpful, but,
Yeah, it says that he goes to strike him, but his hand doesn't move. So it's like, it's contradicting itself on every level. So it's like, I don't know if it's saying that he started and then didn't, because it says that things are moving, but they're not moving. So I think maybe it's just describing like the paradox of, I don't know, if you just spend enough time like paying attention to something, it's like, how does that work in the first place? Or like, I have no idea what this here is. But anyways, that's an interesting little thing. So anyways, he finds a midwife, and then actually he finds two midwives, and one of the midwives is Salome, or maybe it's Salome. I'm pretty sure it's Salome. But anyways, Salome, I'm going to continue calling her that. So I'm sorry if you know that that's not the correct pronunciation. This is, by the way, the name of the wife of Zebedee, according to tradition. So see Mark 16:1. So Salome comes as a midwife, but she is skeptical. And she's like, yeah, no, I don't believe do not believe that Mary is a virgin. So she goes, we're not going to go into depth on this, but she goes and checks with her finger to make sure. After testing, Salome cries aloud and falls back with her hand like withering away, and she's being consumed by fire, and she repents for her unbelief. She's like, please help me. I'm so sorry. I should have never doubted you. And then an angel tells her to touch the baby Jesus after Jesus is born with her finger. And then instantly her finger is healed. And then
this
Yeah.
This is the spicy thing I was talking about. This is way cooler than a dragon.
Yes.
Anyway.
Yeah. And then the angel tells her not to tell anyone that Jesus had come to Jerusalem. Wait, I forgot this part. Whenever Jesus is born, there's just this huge bright cloud that overshadows the cave as Mary gives birth, which acts as epic supernatural privacy for giving birth. And then the supernaturally bright light is also unbearably bright until Jesus comes out and is born. So all that happens, and then Salome is like, I don't believe you. I don't believe you're a virgin. She goes to test with her hands, and then her hand like rides up, and she's like, oh my gosh, like, I'm so sorry. I should have never done this. And then an angel appears and says, yeah, don't ever try that again. Touch Jesus with that hand. She touches Jesus, and her hand is restored back to normal. So the way I take this is pretty much like, hey, late second century Christians, don't even test the virgin birth. Look at this lady who knew Mary, saw her giving birth and tested it with her hands. Not only was it tested by the rituals of the ritual prescribed in the Torah, but this lady gave a physical, undeniable exam, and look at what happened to her. So
yeah, we've all heard stories of people from whatever belief system, including Christianity, where if you ask them any questions, they're like, don't ask any questions. And they'll be like, don't ask any questions. It is a fact, right? Take that fear and multiply that times 10 if you ever dare question if Mary was a virgin. So I do want to say, though, as Christians, Orthodox Christian belief is that Mary was a virgin when she gave birth to Jesus Christ.
yes.
And some traditions will include that it is perpetual virginity. Some traditions do not, right? So, but yeah, don't question it.
Yeah.
Your hand might wither.
Yeah.
Straight up Indiana Jones scene. You're going to melt.
Dude, perfect. Yeah. And so, yeah, we totally believe in the virgin birth of Mary, but this is like making sure, like, just so y'all know, this is a real thing. It got tested instantly. It got tested immediately after Jesus's birth. And yes, she is a virgin. So yeah, anyways, that's near the end of it, the end of the story. That's like the whole climax. And then after that, there's the super bright star that actually makes all the other stars dimmed to the point of invisibility. And that is the star that the wise men follow, which makes it a lot easier to follow. And then it goes to the part where the wise men do their thing. And then whenever Herod sends orders to kill the 2-year-olds, think about it. John the Baptizer is also going to be about the same age as Jesus. And so Elizabeth flees to mountain and hides and prays to God. And then the mountain opens up and then it covers over her so that she's protected. And then Herod asks Zechariah, John the Baptizer's father, where his son is. Where's John the Baptizer? Zechariah refuses to answer. And so Herod kills him at the altar of the temple.
So is that like, that's wow. That's what Jesus says, except that's a different Zechariah, I think, right?
Yes.
Because isn't Jesus referencing like Zechariah from like the prophet from the Old Testament, the minor prophet?
Yes, exactly. So let's see. I thought I took a note. I think it's in Luke chapter 11. I want to say 11:51. Either way, you can look it up. But yeah, Jesus says that this generation, will be guilty of the blood from Abel until Zechariah, who was killed at the altar. So in 2 Chronicles, at the end of 2 Chronicles, which, by the way, in the original Jewish ordering of the Old Testament, Chronicles is at the very end. So Jesus' statement in his generation would have been taken as from the very beginning of the Bible, because Abel is the first person to die, even though Adam is the first person who's told that the punishment of death is now imminent for all humans. Abel's the first person to die. And then in the reading, if you're reading it front to back, Zechariah is the last person to die who dies in the court. But Zechariah, the father of John the Baptist, is also a priest. We know that much. So, but this interprets it, like you said, it's interpreting it as Jesus is saying, from the death of Abel all the way up to Zechariah. So instead of saying you guys are like those who killed the prophets, like I think it's in Matthew 23, but it might be in some other time when Jesus is just ripping to shreds the scribes and Pharisees, where he says like, yeah, you guys build all these fancy tombs and altars and stuff for the prophets, but you guys are exactly like the people who kill the prophets. So like the more the reading that Luke probably had in mind is that Jesus is saying you guys are the very people who killed all the prophets in the Old Testament. You're going to be guilty of that because they're about to kill him, who he's the ultimate fulfillment of the Old Testament and the ultimate prophet. Versus this reading, which is also still kind of cool, but it makes Zechariah, it says every single prophet, even up until today, you're going to be guilty of all of those deaths. But it's also a little bit interesting.
It's including a few other people, like a few hundred years. So, you know.
Yeah, it does include more people, but at the same time, it is a little bit interesting because instead, he could have mentioned somebody, it could have been at the death of like a very recent prophet, like just before Jesus. It seems less Christological, that reading, if that makes sense. Instead of seeing Jesus as, hey, when you kill me, you're making yourself like Cain, like the people who killed Zechariah and all these people, if that makes sense. But yeah, and I have looked into this passage a little bit because this can be a debate about, is the Tanakh the original canon, or were there deuterocanonical books did Jesus consider those books? Because if this is a reference to the Zechariah in 2 Chronicles, which is what we're assuming, it seems the best reading, that seems to point to the Tanakh. But even we have people like Jerome. Jerome says, yeah, I don't really know, to be honest, whether it's Zechariah, the father of John the Baptist, or Zechariah from 2 Chronicles, 2nd Chronicles.
Interesting. Oh, I got a fancy word for you. You ready? The word proto-canonical refers to the books in the Tanakh that the Protestant tradition considers to be the Old Testament. We call them proto-canonical, in case you're curious.
That's good. I guess that makes sense. If the other books are called deuterocanonical, then proto-canonical. That makes sense. That's great. Yeah. So is it a reference to the proto-canonical Zechariah or the New Testament Zechariah? That Protoevangelium of James interprets it as the latter. But anyways, it happens that no one in Israel knows that Zechariah is dead until the priests go in to check on him in the temple courtyard, and a voice declares that his blood will not go away until the avenger comes, and the temple itself starts crying out. And then the priests cast lots to see who will replace Zechariah. In Luke, Zechariah, they cast lots, and I think it mentions that they cast lots, but either way, Zechariah's appointed time to go into the temple whenever an angel appears to him. But anyways, they cast lots to see which priest is going to go in to check on Zechariah. And it ends up being Simeon, who, by the way, in Luke chapter 2, Simeon is the one who has a whole song about Jesus, who sings about how he's going to be a light of revelation to the Gentiles and the glory of his people Israel, and he's going to cause the resurrection and the fall of many people in Israel. So yeah, this is and I did get it right. It's Luke, because I put my note on this passage and not the earlier one. It is Luke 11:51, where it talks about, the blood of all the way from the blood of Abel to the blood of Zechariah. And Simeon is a priest here. So yeah, then James writes a conclusion. He claims to write the story at the end, and that the whole story, he writes that this is his own story and his own account, and that's it. That's the whole Protoevangelium of James.
I have a couple of questions. I don't know if you can answer them, but I guess one question that I have, why is it? Which came first? Because I'm seeing here a connection between Mary being perpetually a virgin and what I believe to be some level of emphasis by the Catholic Church on their clergy, or at least certain positions in their clergy, being unmarried most of the time, 99.9% of the time. And so like I'm seeing that correlation. So which came first? The emphasis on singleness and then the perpetual virginity of marriage, or the other way around, right? Is it that we believe in the perpetual virginity of Mary and then singleness? And then second, I guess a question would be like, functionally, was the purpose for the perpetual virginity of Mary to acknowledge that people are single, right? And that's okay thing? Because Christianity does have a lot, gives dignity to people who don't get married, not just with the stories of people who don't have children getting children, but also you have 1 Corinthians chapter 7, where Paul makes a case for single people getting married. And then there's also a passage in Isaiah, I think. Are you familiar with what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
Where there's like eunuchs who have children or whatever.
Are you talking about the one where Isaiah talks about people who keep the Sabbath, and he says eunuchs as well? Don't say I'm a withered tree because God will bless you, or something to that effect.
Yeah. That's the one I'm thinking about. So I guess that's the second question.
Yeah.
And then, yeah, go for it.
Yeah. So, especially as we get to the Acts, so it seems that there's a really, and first of all, I want to emphasize the importance of something that you're pointing out, is that Christianity is really novel and it's very high view of singleness. If you read a contemporary Jewish author at Jesus's time known as Philo of Alexandria, and he's the first person to write an official full commentary on Genesis, and he gets to the point where he talks about Potiphar, and Potiphar is it could be said that he's a eunuch. I think that's what the Septuagint says, and I'm pretty sure he was reading it in Greek. And so he just goes off on how these are lesser men, and these are so much worse. And so in the first place, that Jesus is saying something so radical as there are eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven, some who are born, some who God has chosen to be that way, and some who choose that for themselves, like that. And then Paul saying yeah, honestly, in my personal opinion, it's better to be a eunuch. My understanding is that virginity being a eunuch there was just a much higher emphasis on that. And then that led to the view on Mary. And we're even going to see, especially once we get into the Acts literature, a lot of the apocryphal Acts are written by what are called Encratites, which is a heresy, and they deny even intercourse within marriage. And so there's this whole thing about how this is the proto-purity culture, and we'll get into that when we get into the Acts. But yeah, it seems to me just overall Christianity just really pushed a lot for singleness and virginity, and this view of Mary's origins and Mary's own continuing on after Jesus was a byproduct of that. Seems to me. That's a great question.
That's a really good answer. Do you have an answer to, I guess, maybe the harder question, maybe not, of which came first, the defense of Mary's perpetual virginity or the emphasis of Catholic clergy being single? And I'm making this connection there that Catholics do have an assumption that Catholics do have somewhat of an exalted view of virginity in one sense or another, not necessarily saying that single people are ontologically superior, but that there is something about that does set you up for ministry or occupational religious work being good. So how would you answer that? Which do you think came first?
I would say probably Mary's perpetual virginity. You already see a really big emphasis. Well, okay, you don't see an emphasis on Mary's perpetual virginity throughout here, but you just see a lot of reasons to be okay, yeah, it seems like she was perpetually a virgin. Although these don't really deal with clergy, my understanding is that the clergy limitations on Catholicism are maybe they're only in the Latin Rite. So there's different and I don't know a lot about Catholicism, but like you said, this is the vast majority of Catholics, because my understanding is that I think the actual statistic is 99% of Catholics are what's called the Latin Rite, and there's just no marrying for clergy within the Latin Rite. But if you're I think it's Eastern Rite, as long as you're married before you become a clergy member, it's okay. I don't think you can marry afterwards, but I think that's more of a later Western development, and I think that's a little bit later. I don't know what century, but I'd assume that that's later.
That's interesting. Thanks. Yeah, and that is a good clarification, right? There's multiple rites within the Roman Catholic Church.
Yeah,
and I guess for listeners who are not familiar with that, that wording, rite, a rite is kind of like a division, the way you break it up.
Yeah. There's different rules, and my understanding, I've seen one person who's in the Eastern Rite, and my understanding is they don't have to say the filioque. They can get married before. They have a different liturgical language. So yeah, anyways, that's a side note. But yeah, those are great questions. But yeah, overall, in the Protoevangelium of James, you really see the story is Mary's story. this is a story about Mary, right? From before conception all the way to her giving birth to Jesus, right? Like it ends after her giving birth to Jesus. And other than the crucifixion and like stories where people say like, oh, your mother and your siblings are outside, like we don't really get any other stories outside of that in the canonical New Testament about Mary. So you can also guess why people were wondering like, who is Mary? And so this, I don't know. For me, I really love, I mean, I've been yapping, explaining this text the whole way through. But if you can tell, I really like the Protoevangelium of James. For me, I mean, it's orthodox, but it's just an unnecessary orthodox thing that I disagree with on Mary staying perpetually a virgin. That doesn't seem to be the best explanation for Jesus's half siblings, and so I'm going to give this a 9 out of 10 orthodoxy index. I love it, but it's just that thing that's a super minor thing that I just disagree on.
Yeah, I'm not going to weigh in. My answer is not going to be related to the perpetual virginity of Mary. But I will say there's nothing in there that seems explicitly unorthodox. And it's an interesting story. And the person who wrote it seemed to be very familiar with the Old Testament. And New Testament writers did write utilizing the Old Testament texts, right? And utilizing the same language, same patterns, same themes as well. And so this was a brilliant writer. And so, with that, actually, I said at the beginning, we're only judging based off of orthodoxy here. But I don't know that orthodoxy is really what I want to be asking with this one. They're saying these things happen. There's nothing here that's like theologically like it's making a statement. And once again, I haven't actually read it, so I haven't gone through the details here. But like writing style, it sounds really cool. It's a little bit different than maybe the structure for novels that we use now today in our contemporary West. I mean, it's cool. I like it. Thank you so much for sharing. It's super interesting.
Yeah, thanks for providing your insights as well, bringing in especially Numbers. I guess this is a big, if you want to prep up for reading this, Numbers is a good backstory for this. And
Numbers 5.
Yeah, Numbers 5. Numbers, man, I can't remember the budding rod for Aaron, but that as well is also from Numbers.
Yeah, for sure.
So, and yeah.
Well, I guess to the audience who's listening here, one thing to be thinking about in Babylonia, we do not treat single people like they're less. We don't in any way. It is okay to be, around single people, build and integrate relationships between married couples and single people, platonic relationships, and like, have like, that's a good thing. We encourage that, and also for those who want to get married, we encourage them to be married because we don't, supposedly there will come a time when people will reject marriage. They will try to teach, do not have marriage. And that's not a good thing either. Marriage is a great thing. So is singleness. Both are great. And when they're in relationship with each other, that's great too. That's how it works in Babylonia.
Yeah.
So if you haven't, and you want to see what that's like, go ahead and get a ticket. You can go have a 3-night stay in Babylonia. We'll be having all kinds of great, there's speakers like Michael, who, you can go ahead and listen to him tell you about the Protoevangelium of James. So, come.
Yeah, that's a great invitation. Next week, it doesn't even have to be 3 nights. You can just come for 1 hour or so as we talk about the next newest great New Testament Apocrypha. So yeah, if you liked this New Testament Apocrypha or you had any other thoughts, anything we skipped over, make sure to leave it in the comments below. But until then, make sure to Bible on.